This screencast is going to start the beginning of chapter 30. So if you want to make sure you download the outline from Moodle before we begin, I had to think about what chapter this is. Yes, chapter 30. Okay, so this chapter is going to kind of wind us down and conclude the Vietnam conflict. And it kind of starts with the significance of the year 1968, because 1968 is a really what we call tumultuous year for the United States and for the world as a whole. There's a lot involved within the civil rights movement. There's a lot involved within American politics, but there's also a lot in that year involved with the war in Vietnam, and that's going to have some of the things that happen in the year have an overall large effect on the conclusion of the war. So we're going to begin with what is known as the Tet Offensive. So Tet refers to the Vietnamese New Year, and during the war in Vietnam in the year 1968, there was supposed to be a week-long truce in honor of Tet. The Viet Cong were not supposed to fight the ARVN or any American soldiers, but predominantly the ARVN, since, you know, the Vietnamese population is going to be who actually celebrates Tet. And so there was supposed to be a truce, no fighting between the two groups. During the New Year, there were going to be many celebrations, but also they were going to hold many funerals for those who were killed in action in the war, those who they hadn't got a chance to honor yet. Now the Viet Cong will be very sneaky, and they will use this opportunity to launch a surprise attack on several South Vietnamese cities going against the truce. Essentially, they kind of scatter themselves in different villages throughout South Vietnam. Remember, they're the rebel group, so they're there anyway. But they disguise themselves as just common villagers, funeral goers. They hide weapons, and they launch a surprise attack. And the surprise attack is a series of attacks that are taking place, like I said, in several villages across South Vietnam, and it lasts for over a month. And that event, that kind of surprise aggression, is known as the Tet Offensive. Now, Westmoreland, who is our American general in Vietnam, he is going to claim that these attacks are a defeat for the Viet Cong, that the Viet Cong actually lost in their offensive plan. And military-wise, that's actually true, because throughout their whole surprise attack, the Viet Cong are actually going to lose more soldiers. They lose, I think, over 30,000 over the course of the month, and the ARVN in the U.S. only lose several thousand, but not anywhere close to 30. However, from a psychological and political standpoint, Westmoreland's claim is incorrect, because the U.S. public opinion is really turning as a result of this offensive. You know, Johnson had kind of begun to tell the American people, the Viet Cong are looking into giving in, they're ready to wind down, let's just give it a few more months of effort and then we'll be able to withdraw. But this event clearly shows the American people that the Viet Cong are not willing and ready to surrender, and that they're going to keep fighting, and that Johnson's kind of lying. And so after the offensive, even though we were able to kind of inflict more damage on them than them to us, the majority of Americans are going to stop supporting our efforts and our involvement in Vietnam. And so it's very much the Tet Offensive that changes public opinion to being in the majority for the war to the majority against the war in terms of our involvement in it. And you can kind of see this chart just shows you the decline over several years and months within those years of our presence in Vietnam. Now, Johnson will actually choose not to run again for re-election in 1968. The divided nation just really takes a great toll on him. And so we'll talk about his predecessor in a second. Or not his predecessor, his successor. So there are going to be many protests that erupt in the mid of the 1968 months for several reasons, and some of these we've actually talked about before in the Civil Rights Movement. So in April of 1968, that's when Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, and so you had, because of that, violent riots breaking out across the nation. And then just within a couple of months after that, the Democratic Party's primary candidate for president in replacement of Johnson was also assassinated. That was John F. Kennedy's younger brother, Robert Kennedy. And people are upset with that because he was also involved in the Civil Rights Movement. And we're going to see college campuses really become a focal point location for holding many of these protests. And a large amount of these demonstrations and protests are in kind of angry rioting, is not necessarily only in response to civil rights, but it's starting to become more so in connection with the U.S.'s involvement in Vietnam. That is becoming like the key protest topic. And we're going to see students have their voices grow louder and louder across the nation, and we'll talk more about that tomorrow. It is going to be President Richard Nixon who wins the presidential election in 1968. Nixon was a Republican, and he campaigned on a platform of restoring law and order and restoring peace, and this really appeals to many Americans who are ready for a little bit of a break and want to calm down, and they want a pause from the several years of riots and tension and protests. And Nixon is also going to kind of promise to finish and end the war in Vietnam. And he will be the president to do so, just not before more controversy is stirred. So let's kind of start looking at Nixon's role in Vietnam and how he plans to, quote-unquote, begin the ending process, begin slowing down the process of our involvement in Vietnam. So, the summer after he was sworn into office, he is going to announce that the first troops are beginning to be withdrawn from Vietnam. And this is from South Vietnam, because that's where we have our presence, fighting the Viet Cong. We're not actually fighting, like, feet on the ground in North Vietnam. Now, while he does begin to withdraw some of the troops from South Vietnam, he is very much continuing his bombing campaign in North Vietnam, and that is going to prolong the war. So, to kind of talk about how we escalate the withdrawal process of removing our troops from Vietnam, we kind of begin entering into negotiations with the North Vietnamese. Now keep in mind, a lot of our fighting dealt with more so the South Vietnamese rebel army, the Viet Cong. That's who we often find ourselves more directly fighting. But we are more concerned about once we leave, our biggest concern is that then Ho Chi Minh in the North will use that as an opportunity to invade the South and to take over. And so the U.S. is going to basically demand that North Vietnam not attempt to invade the South and to withdraw any troops they had in South Vietnam, if they had any, and to basically allow the South Vietnamese government to continue to be in power of South Vietnam. And the North kind of demands that we just leave. Ho Chi Minh is not really one to want to negotiate with the United States. We're making these demands of him, these requests of him, like we promise we'll leave whenever you stop sending any aid to the Viet Cong, or you promise to leave South Vietnam alone. And Ho Chi Minh's just thinking this has nothing to do with you, and you just need to leave regardless. And so Nixon and his kind of national security team they're gonna come up with a new plan that is called Vietnamization, which is spelled just how it sounds, Vietnam, and ization, I-Z-A-T-I-O-N. And this refers to the gradual withdrawal of U.S. troops and the gradual transfer of responsibility of the war from the United States to the South Vietnamese government and military force. Even though we're fighting for their side, we are ready for South Vietnam to take primary control and authority over their war efforts in South Vietnam. So we're basically, Vietnamization refers to gradually handing over the war to South Vietnam and hoping that they will hold their own and prevent any sort of North Vietnamese takeover. Now, we don't want to make it seem, and Nixon certainly doesn't want to make it seem like we're just leaving because we can't win. And so Nixon kind of comes up with a plan to save face, if you will, and that involves a plan called Peace with Honor. And essentially, as he withdrew troops over the months and the years that followed his presidency, he is going to continue large-scale bombing campaigns, not only in North Vietnam, but also in two other countries neighboring to the west, Cambodia and Laos. And this is because North Vietnamese leader Ho Chi Minh is using those two countries, Cambodia and Laos, to form a trail that cuts through those two countries, and the trail includes the North Vietnamese delivering supplies by cutting through those two countries into South Vietnam and delivering supplies to the Viet Cong rebels. And so that trail is known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail, named after Ho Chi Minh. And we're aware of this trail, and we're gonna bomb it heavily as we kind of leave, kind of just as a final punch, if you will. Now, the last thing we're going to talk about in today's screencast is a very upsetting thing, and that is the My Lai massacre. And it's an event that took place in Vietnam actually months prior, even months before Nixon took office. But Americans are going to find out about it soon after Nixon takes office, and so this is when it becomes public knowledge, even though it was a much older event. So essentially, in the spring of 1968, a U.S. platoon was responsible for the massacre of innocent civilians, innocent South Vietnamese civilians, in the small town, small village of My Lai in South Vietnam. Now, they were there searching for Viet Cong infiltrators and agents, and they actually didn't find any. And out of a bit of delusion and aggression and frustration, the leaders of the platoon order that everything in My Lai be destroyed, and the U.S. soldiers are actually responsible for rounding up over 200 innocent Vietnamese civilians and killing them. This is probably one of the most disgusting and horrific events in American military history. It is not something that people are proud to learn about or talk about, but I think it's important we just acknowledge it. And I will just say that obviously once Americans at home find this information out, then that just turns their opinion of the war to being even further against the war. And they look at all of the U.S. soldiers who are fighting in South Vietnam as potentially having partaken in this type of event, even though that's not the case. And so things like this really gave the Vietnam veterans a bad name, and it's one of the reasons that people are almost very hostile to these veterans when they return home from the war, which is very, very sad and has a very negative effect on them. Okay, we're going to stop taking notes for now. Please write down any questions you have, and I will see you all tomorrow.